Did you know that a chunk of Australia holds a meteorite crater almost a kilometer wide that Europeans didn't even find until 1947? Or that there's a waterfall in the outback that runs sideways? How about the fact that some of the oldest paintings made by human hands anywhere on Earth are sitting on cliffs that most people will never see? Well, there's a lot more to the Kimberley than red dirt and cattle stations. Look a little closer, and you'll see it sitting on top of some of the most insane geography on the planet. And today we're breaking down 32 facts that will completely change how you see the Kimberley. Let's get into it. 32. The region bigger than most countries. The Kimberley covers roughly 420,000 square kilometres in the far north of Western Australia, an area close to 3 times the size of England, packed into one of the least populated corners of the country. Most of it has no sealed roads. Whole sections only open up for half the year, when the dry season finally lets vehicles through. A landmass that size, and most Australians have never set foot in it. That's not an accident. That's just how remote this place actually is. 31. The crater nobody found for thousands of years. On the edge of the Great Sandy Desert sits Wolf Creek Crater, an almost perfectly circular scar, 880 meters across, one of the largest meteorite craters on the planet, with fragments still recovered from the site. Aboriginal people had a name for it, and stories about it long before anyone else. Europeans only spotted it in 1947, during an aerial survey, when a pilot and 2 geologists noticed a shape in the desert that had no business being that round. A hole that size, sitting in plain sight, and it took a plane in the sky to finally notice it. Number 30. The crater hiding on the same range as the famous domes. Purnululu National Park is famous for the striped Bungle Bungle domes. What most visitors don't know is that the same plateau carries a second scar from space. A few kilometers away from the domes everyone photographs. The Piccaninny structure is a roughly 7-kilometer wide circular feature, the eroded remnant of an ancient impact, clearly visible from satellite images and even photographed from the International Space Station, but nearly invisible from ground level. People have been standing on this range for decades without realizing the ground under their feet carries the scar of a strike from space. The evidence was there the whole time. It just needed an orbit to see it properly. Number 29. The beehives that took a documentary crew to notice. The Bungle Bungle Range sits inside 600,000 protected acres, sandstone domes striped orange and black, some rising the height of a 75-story building. Cattle ranchers and Aboriginal people had known about the range for generations. It wasn't until a muster pilot tipped off a film crew making a documentary in the 1980s that the wider world found out. Their footage caused enough of a stir that the range became a national park in 1987 and a World Heritage Site by 2003. An entire mountain range of striped stone towers sat unknown to the outside world until a chance conversation with a pilot changed everything. 28. The stripes that are actually a chemistry lesson. Those orange and black bands on the Bungle Bungle domes aren't paint, and they aren't erosion patterns for decoration. The orange layers are sandstone that dried out enough to oxidize, rusting like iron left in the rain. The dark grey bands are the layers that stayed wet enough to host a thin skin of living cyanobacteria holding the grains together. One colour is rust, the other colour is alive. Every dome in the park is wearing a geology lesson and a biology lesson at the same time, and almost nobody looking up at them realizes it. Number 27. The waterfall that runs sideways. Talbot Bay's horizontal falls aren't really waterfalls at all. 2 narrow gaps cut through the Maclarty Range, one about 20 meters wide, the other closer to 10, and the tide does the rest. With a variation of up to 10 meters between low and high water, the sea gets rammed through the gaps hard enough to look like a waterfall lying on its side. Sir David Attenborough is widely quoted as calling it one of the greatest wonders of the natural world. The ocean built a waterfall without ever needing a cliff to fall off of. 26. The tide's too big for most of the planet to handle. Around the Kimberley coast, tidal ranges regularly swing past 10 meters, among the most extreme tidal movements anywhere in the southern hemisphere. Boats that sit in deep water at high tide can be resting on dry mud a few hours later. Jetties in towns like Derby are built as long sloped ramps instead of flat platforms, just to cope with the swing, essentially flipping the water level by the height of a multi-story building twice a day. Most coastlines measure their tides in inches worth arguing about. The Kimberley measures its tides in stories of a building. 25. The reef that disappears and reappears every single day. Montgomery Reef looks like open ocean at high tide and nothing more. Then the water drops, and one of the largest inshore reefs in Australia rises straight out of the sea, water pouring off its edges in sheets like a waterfall running in reverse. It happens twice a day, every day, driven entirely by the same extreme tides hammering the rest of the coast. A reef that surfaces on a schedule, revealing itself to anyone patient enough to wait for the tide to turn. Number 24. The twin falls that only exist part of the year. King George Falls drop from a cliff roughly the height of a 25-story building into the King George River below, twin curtains of white water pouring into emerald pools. They only run at full strength when the wet season soaks the land, typically from around April onward. Show up in the dry months, and the cliffs can sit almost silent. A waterfall that keeps its own calendar and shows its full power only when the season decides it's time. Number 23. The rock art older than the pyramids, and still arguing about exactly how old. Kimberley sandstone shelters hold an estimated 100,000 individual rock art images. Among them, the Jiweon figures, slender human forms carrying spears and bags, painted with a level of detail that baffled the first European observers who saw them in the 1890s. Scientists radiocarbon dated 24 mud wasp nests layered over and under the paintings and found most of the Gwion figures were made around 12,000 years ago, more than twice as old as the pyramids of Giza. One single nest pushed the minimum age of one painting even further back, past 17,000 years old. Human hands were making detailed art on these cliffs while the last ice age was still winding down. Number 22. The paintings still being made after thousands of years. Alongside the ancient Gwion figures sit the Wandjina, cloud and rain spirit beings with wide eyes and no mouths, a tradition believed to stretch back around 4,000 years, and one that is still actively maintained by traditional owners today. This isn't a dead gallery frozen in time, it's a living tradition, repainted and cared for by the same communities whose ancestors started it. Most rock art sites in the world are ruins. This one still has an artist. 21. The tree that might be older than the written word. Boab trees grow only in the Kimberley and nowhere else in Australia, swollen, bottle-shaped trunks that can reach a girth of 20 metres. Some individual boabs are estimated at over 1,500 years old, making them among the oldest living things in the entire country. Nobody is fully certain how the species got to Australia in the first place, with theories ranging from ocean currents carrying seeds from Africa to a shared ancestry dating back to the supercontinent Gondwana. A tree nobody can fully explain the arrival of, still standing after a millennium and a half. And if a tree older than most nations on Earth isn't reason enough to see the rest of what this place is hiding, subscribe. Because we've still got 21 facts left, and some of them are stranger than this. 20. The tree that became a jail cell. Just outside Derby stands a boab with a trunk hollow enough to walk inside, roughly 1,500 years old with a girth near 14.7 metres. Colonial era stories describe it being used to hold Aboriginal prisoners overnight on their way to sentencing, though historians have since found no solid evidence it was ever actually used that way. True or not, the story stuck hard enough that it's known across the region simply as the prison tree. A tree that outlived empires ended up carrying a reputation it may never have earned. Number 19. The ancient reef you can walk through on dry land. Long before the Bungle Bungles existed, a coral reef system grew along what is now the Napier and Oscar Ranges, roughly 350 million years ago, when this part of the Kimberley sat under a shallow tropical sea. Today, that fossilized reef forms towering limestone walls, carved through by gorges like Windjana and Tunnel Creek, where the old reef structure is still visible in the rock. A reef built by ancient sea creatures is now a dry limestone range in the middle of the outback, and you can walk straight through the fossilized version of a barrier reef. 18. The Tunnel, a river carved straight through a reef. Tunnel Creek cuts almost a kilometer clean through that same ancient reef system, a natural tunnel dark enough that visitors need to wade through pools of water in complete blackness to reach the other side. Freshwater crocodiles share the tunnel with the bats roosting in its ceiling. A river didn't just cross the old reef, it drilled straight through the middle of it and kept going. 17. The river that reverses its own logic every wet season. The Fitzroy River can run almost dry for months at a time, then swell during the wet season into one of the most powerful rivers in the country, moving more water in a single flood than some rivers move in a year. Homes and roads built along its banks are designed around the assumption that the river will eventually try to reclaim them. A river that spends half the year barely moving and the other half rewriting the landscape around it. 16. The lake that swallowed 20 harbours worth of water. Lake Argyll, formed by damming the Ord River, holds a volume of water often compared to more than 20 times Sydney Harbour, making it one of the largest man-made reservoirs by volume in the country. It didn't just create a lake, it created its own weather patterns and its own freshwater crocodile population, thriving in water that didn't exist before the dam went in. An entire inland sea, built on purpose, sitting in the middle of a desert that used to have none of it. Number 15. The mine that pulled pink out of the ground. For 37 years, the Argyll Diamond Mine near Lake Argyll produced around 90% of the world's rare pink diamonds, a supply so dominant that when the mine finally closed in November of 2020, prices for pink stones began climbing almost immediately, some categories by more than 20% within a single year, on the certainty that this specific source of colour was never coming back. One mine site, buried in a remote pocket of the Kimberley, controlled a colour of diamond the rest of the planet could barely find anywhere else. 14. The gorge shaped like a cathedral for a reason. Cathedral Gorge inside the Bungle Bungles opens into a vast natural amphitheatre. Its curved sandstone walls carved by centuries of flash flooding, funneling water and sediment through a single point. The acoustics inside are strong enough that musicians have performed concerts there, the stone doing the work speakers usually do. Water did not just carve a gorge, it carved a concert hall out of solid rock and left the seating for free. 13. The chasm barely wide enough for shoulders. Echidna Chasm, also inside Pernalulu, narrows in places to barely more than a metre wide while its walls climb roughly 200 metres overhead. At midday, direct sunlight drops straight down the gap and briefly lights the base in a way that's only possible for a short window each day. A crack in the earth that only reveals its full colour for a few minutes, on a schedule set by the sun, rather than by anyone visiting it. Number 12. The waterfall built in 4 separate steps. Punami Unpu, known widely as Mitchell Falls, drops in 4 distinct tiers as the Mitchell River works its way toward the coast, each level spilling into a pool before continuing to the next. It's one of the most recognizable waterfalls in the Kimberley, and one of the hardest to reach, sitting deep enough into the remote north that most visitors only see it by helicopter or a multi-day trek. A 4-part waterfall that the region makes you work hard to earn a look at. 11. The archipelago with more islands than most people can count. The Buccaneer Archipelago scatters close to 800 islands across the coastline near Talbot Bay, carved by the same extreme tides that create the horizontal falls. Many of the islands are uninhabited, some barely more than rock poking above the tide line, reshaped twice a day by water moving fast enough to count as a natural current generator. An entire coastline broken into hundreds of pieces by tides most places on Earth never come close to experiencing. If you've made it this far, and you still didn't know any of this was sitting inside your own country, hit subscribe. There are 11 facts left, and we saved some of the strangest ones for the end. Number 10. The saltwater crocodiles that outnumber the towns. Estuarine saltwater crocodiles patrol the tidal rivers and coastline of the Kimberley in numbers that dwarf the human populations scattered across the same region. Freshwater crocodiles handle the inland gorges. Saltwater crocodiles hold the coast and the river mouths, and they are not shy about swimming a surprising distance upstream when the water lets them. In much of the Kimberley, the apex predator was never in question, and it was never human. 9. The road that only exists for half the year. The Gibb River Road runs close to 660 kilometers through the heart of the Kimberley, a mostly unsealed track connecting some of the region's most remote gorges and stations. During the wet season, river crossings along the route can become impassable for weeks at a time, and every year a few unlucky drivers find out exactly how impassable the hard way. One of Australia's most iconic outback drives spends part of every year simply not being drivable, and the locals mention that about as casually as you would mention the milk running low. 8. The coastline red enough to look painted. Cape Levesque, at the tip of the Dampier Peninsula, is famous for cliffs that shift into a deep rust red against startlingly turquoise water, a colour contrast strong enough that it looks digitally enhanced in most photographs even though it isn't. The red comes from iron oxide in the sandstone, the same chemistry staining the Bungle Bungle domes hundreds of kilometres away. Different landmark, same iron, same rust, same reason the Kimberley keeps turning up in that colour. 7. The mud volcano nobody expects out here. Scattered pockets of the Kimberley coastline host small mud volcanoes and mineral-rich springs, spots like Zebedee Springs near El Cuestro, where naturally warm, mineral-rich water bubbles up through limestone into a series of small thermal pools shaded by Livistona palms. A hot spring, palm trees, and a desert plateau, all sitting within a short walk of each other in a region most people picture as flat red dirt and nothing else. Number 6. The dinosaur footprints locked into an entire coastline. Along parts of the Kimberley coast, dinosaur trackways preserved in exposed rock represent one of the most significant collections of dinosaur footprints anywhere on Earth. Imprinted in sediment estimated at around 130 million years old and only visible at certain low tides. Traditional owners have long known and named these tracks as part of their own histories, well before paleontologists arrived to study them formally. An entire coastline doubling as a fossil record, uncovered only when the tide agrees to step back. 5. The plateau that time genuinely forgot. The Mitchell Plateau in the far north Kimberley holds patches of monsoon rainforest completely isolated from the rest of Australia's rainforest systems. Small green pockets surrounded by dry savanna and sandstone for hundreds of kilometres in every direction. Species found in these isolated pockets have had thousands of years to drift apart from their nearest relatives elsewhere on the continent. Islands of jungle, stranded in the middle of the driest, hardest country around them. 4. The reef the divers still don't fully understand. The Rowley Shoals, off the Kimberley coast, are a set of coral atolls rising abruptly from deep ocean water, largely untouched by the coastal development and fishing pressure that reef systems closer to major cities usually face. Their remoteness has kept them close to pristine, which also means far fewer people have ever studied them in detail compared to more accessible reef systems. One of the healthiest reef systems in the country, and one of the least visited, purely because of how far it sits from everything else. 3. The coastline where pearling built entire towns. Broome, on the Kimberley's western edge, grew almost entirely around the pearling industry, drawing workers from Japan, China, and the Malay archipelago in the late 1800s in numbers substantial enough to shape the town's culture to this day. A pearl shell industry, chasing something found at the bottom of the ocean, ended up building one of the most culturally layered towns in the entire country. 2. The plateau, older than almost anything alive to see it. Large sections of the Kimberley Plateau, including the King Leopold sandstone that Mitchell Falls has spent millions of years cutting through, were laid down somewhere between 1.8 billion and 1.6 billion years ago, old enough to make this rock older than most complex life on the planet by an almost incomprehensible margin. The famous striped domes of the Bungle Bungles are a completely different, much younger story. Sandstone laid down a mere 360 million years ago. Even inside one region, Australia's geology refuses to agree on how old anything is. 1. The frontier that still hasn't finished revealing itself. Between craters nobody found for thousands of years, waterfalls that run sideways, rock art older than agriculture, and a plateau built before complex life existed, the Kimberley keeps handing over discoveries decades apart instead of all at once. Most of the region still isn't mapped in detail. Most of the caves haven't been surveyed. There's a real chance the biggest thing hiding in the Kimberley hasn't been found yet. The rest of Australia has spent 2 centuries deciding what the country is, and the whole time, this corner of it just kept quietly being older, stranger, and bigger than anyone bothered to check. Australia is bigger than the map they gave you. Subscribe and we will show you the rest of it.